Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Monday, March 3rd, 2025. All right, so we have a lot of stuff to go over today. Just a lot going on. A lot happened over the weekend. The big news, of course, was the little spat between Trump, Zelensky, and J.D. Vance at the Oval Office. And we will definitely get into that, but there's some really bad news related to Gaza and this whole collapsing ceasefire deal that I want to go through first. So the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, Israel blocks all aid to Gaza as phase 1 ends. So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced on Sunday that Israel was imposing a total siege on the Gaza Strip, blocking all goods from entering, including humanitarian aid, as the Israeli military ramped up attacks on the territory, killing at least 4 Palestinians. Netanyahu's announcement came a day after the first phase of the Gaza hostage and ceasefire deal expired and no agreement has been reached on the second phase. Under the deal, negotiations for the second phase were supposed to start on February 3rd, but Israel refused to engage in those talks and is now demanding that Hamas accept a last-minute proposal that Israel said was put forward by President Trump's Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff. The U.S. proposal would involve another 42-day ceasefire and the immediate release of half of the Israeli hostages that are in Gaza. The proposal does not include a full Israeli withdrawal or permanent ceasefire, which were conditions of Phase 2, which is what Hamas is really trying to get Israel to do. And as far as I understand it as well, that under the deal, if the negotiations were still ongoing for the second phase, when the first phase ended, then the ceasefire would just automatically extend. But those negotiations just haven't even happened. So Netanyahu's office said in a statement, quote, upon the conclusion of the first stage and in light of Hamas's rejection of the Witkoff framework, we decided at last night's discussion that as of this morning, the entry of goods and supplies into Gaza will be prevented. If Hamas continues to stick to its position and does not release our hostages, there will be additional consequences, which I will not detail here, end quote. And Netanyahu is saying that this is being done in coordination with the U.S. So this is him announcing the total siege on Gaza, ending the aid shipments, collective punishment of Gaza, which about half the population is children. Just a war crime, blatant war crime that he's announced. And this is being completely backed by the U.S. So in response, Israel said that Israel's move... Sorry, I mixed that up there. In response, Hamas said Israel's move was a violation of the ceasefire deal. Hamas said in a statement, quote, the statement issued by the Office of the Terrorist Occupation Prime Minister Netanyahu regarding his approval of American proposals to extend the first phase of the agreement under arrangements that violate the ceasefire agreement in Gaza is a blatant attempt to evade the agreement and avoid entering negotiations for its second phase. Netanyahu's decision to halt humanitarian aid is a form of blackmail, a war crime, and a blatant violation of the agreement, end quote. Later on Sunday, a Hamas official said that the group would not agree to an extension of the first phase of the ceasefire and called for the implementation of the second phase under the terms of the original deal. The U.S. has backed Israel's decision to cut off aid to the civilian population of Gaza, and this came after the U.S. approved billions in new military aid for Israel, which we'll get into in the next story. White House National Security Council spokesman Brian Hughes told Axios reporter Barak Ravid that the U.S. will, quote, support Israel's decision on next steps given Hamas has indicated it's no longer interested in a negotiated ceasefire, end quote, which is just a completely dishonest way to frame it because Hamas is saying they want to negotiate the second phase under the initial ceasefire deal. Hughes also claimed that Israel had been negotiating in good faith, despite the fact that Israel, again, refused to enter talks on the second phase. That was a big violation of the deal. And Israel has constantly violated this thing, killing over 100 Palestinians since January 19th when it went into effect. And Wafa, the Palestinian news agency, reported that Israeli attacks hit targets across Gaza on Sunday, killing 2 Palestinians in the northern city of Beit Hanun. A woman was killed by Israeli forces near the southern city of Khan Yunis, and another Palestinian was killed in Rafah. So, I mean, the situation has been horrific in Gaza. It just got a lot worse. And I mean, things could really explode. We could really see some heavy bombing start up again. And the U.S., again, just giving full support for this. The Trump administration is signing off on all sorts of new military aid to Israel. So the next story here, Rubio expedites shipment of $4 billion in military aid for Israel. So on Saturday, Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced that he had expedited the shipment of $4 billion in military aid for Israel, a strong show of support for Israel as it is threatening to restart its genocidal war on Gaza. Rubio said in a statement, quote, "I have signed a declaration to use emergency authorities to expedite the delivery of approximately $4 billion in military assistance to Israel," end quote. He claimed that President Biden imposed a partial arms embargo on Israel, although Biden provided more military aid to Israel in a single year than any U.S. president in history. This idea that he imposed any kind of arms embargo is just complete partisan nonsense. But anyway, Rubio's statement said, quote, "The decision to reverse the Biden administration's partial arms embargo, which wrongly withheld a number of weapons and ammunition from Israel, is yet another sign that Israel is no greater ally in the White House than President Trump," end quote. Rubio said that since President Trump came into office on January 20th, his administration has approved $12 billion in arms deals for Israel in just over a month. Just despicable stuff here. Rubio said, quote, "The Trump administration will continue to use all available tools to fulfill America's long-standing commitment to Israel's security, including means to counter security threats," end quote. So the statement came a day after the State Department approved 3 separate arms deals for Israel worth nearly $3 billion. So $3 billion on Friday, and then in arms, you know, they call them arms sales, but they'll almost certainly be funded by U.S. military aid. So $3 billion of that is approved on Friday. And then Saturday, Rubio says he's expediting the shipment of $4 billion in weapons. It's not exactly clear if there's crossover here between the $3 billion approved on Friday and what Rubio says he's expediting. I think we might get a clearer picture in the coming days of exactly what, but at the same time, they're just not being transparent at all. Rubio just says, $4 billion in military assistance to Israel, and doesn't detail what that is. And in both of these cases, they invoked so-called emergency powers here to ship these weapons, to bypass Congress. Again, just really makes me sick, this stuff. And the biggest sale out of this $3 billion in arms sales, again, they call it a sale, but again, this is going to be funded by U.S. military aid. The biggest sale includes 35,500 2,000-pound bombs. These are these huge bombs that Israel has dropped on residential buildings. They've dropped, figured out that if they drop them on the tunnels, it creates a deadly gas that they then weaponize that gas to kill people, and in some cases have killed Israeli hostages. This is what they're giving them. And the second arms deal is for 5,000 1,000-pound bombs. And another deal is for bulldozers, the Caterpillar armored bulldozers that are used to demolish Palestinian homes in the West Bank and in Gaza. I mean, they were used to demolish entire cities, entire neighborhoods in Gaza. So when approving, again, these 3 deals on Friday, the State Department claimed that it was an emergency and bypassed Congress. The Pentagon said, quote, "The Secretary of State has determined and provided detailed justification that an emergency exists that requires the immediate sale to the government of Israel of the above defense articles and defense services in the national security interests of the United States, thereby waiving the congressional review requirements under Section 36B of the Arms Export Control Act," end quote. So you see all this talk this weekend from the thing that happened with Zelensky, all this stuff about, oh, we shouldn't be funding this foreign conflict and continuing it. And then when it comes to Israel and Gaza and this genocide and slaughter and ethnic cleansing, just all goes out the window. Just give Israel whatever they want, all on the U.S. taxpayer dime. And no matter how brutal things are, always find an excuse for it, find an excuse for starving people, for blowing up women and children. It's just sickening, like I said. All right, so the next one here. Israel killed 16 children in the West Bank since 2025 began. This article is from the Palestine Chronicle. So the Israeli army has killed 16 Palestinian children in the occupied West Bank since the beginning of 2025, despite them posing no real threat to the soldiers, according to the Defense for Children International. And, we've been covering, most of these killings we've covered on this show, but I just figured it was worth running this story. Again, 16 kids, and one that they highlight is the killing of Ayman al-Hamouni, a 13-year-old Palestinian who was killed on February 22nd in the city of Hebron. And the child posed no threat at the moment he was killed. He was facing away. He was shot in the back by an Israeli soldier who was firing from an armored vehicle. They're just murdering children in the West Bank. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. says Zelensky blew up the minerals deal. So Kyle Anzalone on Friday wrote about the showdown between Zelensky, Vance, and Trump in the Oval Office. Kyle actually wrote a bunch of stuff on Friday because there was just so much happening with that. So, the thing, and a lot of people have talked about this. It's been a few days now. The thing people should understand, if they haven't watched the full 50-minute press conference. So this was Trump and Zelensky and J.D. Vance and other officials in the Oval Office speaking to reporters before they were going to have their closed-door meeting and sign this minerals deal. Throughout this, the first 40 minutes or 30 to 40 minutes, Trump is saying, we're going to sign a deal. We're going to keep giving military aid to Ukraine. And then essentially what happens is a reporter asks Trump about, how can you trust Putin with diplomacy? And Trump gives his spiel. And then J.D. Vance says, I'll take that. And he talks about, what he said was great. Again, when he talks about Ukraine, J.D. Vance, it always sounds great. Wish he would apply it to Israel. But he's saying, for years we tried this tough guy approach from Biden, thumping his chest. And that didn't bring about any sort of, that didn't resolve the war. So we got to try diplomacy. And then Zelensky decides to ask Vance a question and say all this stuff. Putin has an honored past agreement, blah, blah, blah. What kind of... So I got this clip here. I just want to play. It's just like a minute. I'm sure most people have watched this, but this is when things turned. This is at the end of Zelensky's little spiel, and you'll see J.D. Vance's reaction. And another thing that I thought was significant that Trump said a few times in this after when things got heated was that Zelensky doesn't want a ceasefire. Zelensky doesn't want to end the war. And there's reasons for that. And one of the main ones is that, he would lose power. They would have elections and he would get voted out. So let's just listen to this little clip here.
Signed the exchange of prisoners, but he didn't do it. What kind of diplomacy, JD, you are speaking about? What do you mean?
I'm talking about the kind of diplomacy that's going to end the destruction of your country.
Yes, but if you
Mr. President, with respect, I think it's disrespectful for you to come into the Oval Office and try to litigate this in front of the American media. Right now, you guys are going around and forcing conscripts to the front lines because you have manpower problems. You should be thanking the President for trying to bring an end to this conflict.
Have you ever been to Ukraine that you say what problems we have?
I have been to.
Come once.
I've actually watched and seen the stories, and I know what happens is you bring them on a propaganda tour, Mr. President. Do you disagree that you've had problems bringing people into your military? And do you think that it's respectful to come to the Oval Office of the United States of America and attack the administration that is trying to prevent the destruction of your country?
A lot of questions. Let's start from the...
So, this goes on. Trump interjects, and Zelensky keeps kind of interrupting him. And, you watch this, and it just, Zelensky could have just kept his mouth shut. And Trump would have signed the deal and would have promised to continue providing military aid. But instead, Zelensky was kicked out of the White House. And now this story from Sunday, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who was the one that initially brought the mineral deal to Zelensky in Kiev, says that the deal is not on the table anymore because Zelensky decided to blow it up. And he said, Trump, they were ready to sign the deal and continue the military aid. Besant told CBS News host Margaret Brennan, quote, all President Zelensky had to do was come in and sign this economic agreement and again show no daylight between Ukrainian people and the American people. And he chose to blow that up, end quote. So this deal, which would give the U.S. access to not just the rare earth minerals, but oil, gas, other natural resources. Both Trump and Besant, and he says it in this interview, made it clear that this would make the U.S. more committed to Ukraine and essentially bind the U.S. to continuing to give them military aid and everything. Besant said the purpose of the deal was, quote, to further intertwine the American people and the Ukrainian people and show no daylight, end quote. So I think, this deal was bad because it would just commit the U.S. more to Ukraine and give them more reason, again, to keep the war going, to control more territory in Ukraine. So I think the whole blow up ultimately was a good thing. And I mean, there's just so much to say about it. And again, I know this is what has been the big news of the weekend, but we have so much other stuff to talk about and, a lot more related to this too. So the next one here, this is the big question now. Trump considers ending all aid to Ukraine. So this one is from Kyle Anzalone. So this came out Friday night after the Oval Office blow up. The White House is considering ending all aid transfers, including weapons, to Ukraine after an Oval Office press conference turned into an argument between President Trump, Vice President Vance, and Zelensky. According to the Washington Post, the Trump administration is considering ending all ongoing shipments of military aid to Ukraine in response to President Zelensky's remarks in the Oval Office on Friday and his perceived intransigence in the peace process. And one thing that Trump said in a statement after the meeting was that it's clear with the U.S. backing Zelensky, he's not going to want peace. So, essentially hinting that he's going to cut him off. That's the only way to bring peace. And he also said something similar in the press conference to Zelensky. He was like, I'm just going to let you fight it out. We're going to cut you off and you're going to just have to fight it out. And it's not going to be pretty. So he's basically hinting at that the U.S. is going to cut the weapons supply. And hopefully whatever happens, that this leads to a ceasefire and peace in Ukraine, because, you have the Europeans doing all sorts of things, making all sorts of promises for Ukraine. But ultimately, I think they've even said, that they can't do this without the U.S. So the next one here, the DoD halts cyber attacks on Russia to encourage talks. This one is from Kyle at the Libertarian Institute. So Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth ordered his agency to halt offensive cyber operations against Russia as the White House is attempting to engage the Kremlin in talks to end the war in Ukraine. So the New York Times reported that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has ordered U.S. Cyber Command to halt offensive operations against Russia. And the move is apparently part of a broader effort to draw Putin of Russia into talks on Ukraine and a new relationship with the U.S. So kind of some sort of overture toward Russia. Hopefully there's real talks going on behind the scenes, even with all this drama with Zelensky about what a potential peace deal could look like. All right, so the next one here, the UK and France are working on an alternative Ukraine plan. So this is another one from Kyle at the Libertarian Institute. The British Prime Minister said he was working with the French and Ukrainian presidents to develop an alternative peace plan for Ukraine than the one being developed by President Donald Trump. So Prime Minister Keir Starmer has discussed sending British troops to Ukraine to enforce any agreement. And Starmer, after the meeting, after the clash between Trump and Zelensky, he welcomed Zelensky with open arms. And he said that this meeting left the UK and France rushing to develop an alternative strategy. So Starmer said, quote, the UK and France are the most advanced in the thinking on this, and that's why President Macron and I are going to be working on this plan, which we'll then discuss with the US. This is a step in the right direction. This is not an exclusion, the more the better in this, but we need to move to a quicker, more agile way of going forward. And I think that is a coalition of the willing states, end quote. The fact that he used the term a coalition of the willing, I mean, that just, anytime I hear that, I think of the Iraq War and what the George W. Bush administration would call countries willing to go in on the invasion, to support the invasion, which of course included the UK. You just got to be aware of that language, especially if you're a guy like Starmer. But he said, he suggested that London could send British troops to Ukraine. And he's just saying this over and over, that they're ready to send troops to Ukraine. But even, when he starts talking about the details, he says, and we need the U.S. to support it. And, so I just don't think that they're really going to do anything. I don't know. I think this is all kind of a pipe dream. And I hope that I'm right about that, because, if they do just try to deploy troops outside of some sort of peace deal, then that would mean some direct fighting with Russia. So anyway, the next one here, European leaders voice support for Zelensky after Trump meeting. So this is another one from Kyle that he wrote on Friday, or actually he wrote this on Saturday, it looks like. After an Oval Office meeting between Trump and Zelensky turned into an argument in front of the press, several leaders of NATO nations made public statements in support of the Ukrainian leader. So there was all these statements from European leaders saying what happened in the in the Oval Office was bad, and that they stand with Ukraine, they stand with Ukraine's sovereignty. And Zelensky spent his Friday night after the meeting just retweeting everybody and writing, "Thank you for your support." I put this video up, just scrolling through his X feed, and it's just him retweeting, quote tweeting these leaders saying, "Thank you for your support, thank you for your support, thank you for your support." But things aren't looking good for Zelensky. I mean, again, when we talk about what's at stake for him, if he signs a deal that gives away Ukrainian territory, all this war that he led was for nothing, and they have an election, he's toast. And this is going to be his legacy. So he wants to keep this thing going, it seems like. I think that's very clear. It doesn't seem like it. I think he's made it very clear. So, he's looking now, I think, at the Europeans to give him some kind of backing. But I still think ultimately they're not going to go ahead and do anything without the U.S. So I think hopefully this thing does come to an end soon, and Zelensky realizes that he's just got to give it up. All right, so the next one here, Trump eases restrictions on strikes and special ops. So this is a concerning story here. So President Trump has eased restrictions on U.S. airstrikes and special operations raids in areas outside of countries officially considered combat zones by the U.S., giving U.S. military commanders the freedom to launch attacks without permission from the White House. The order reverts back to the policy of the first Trump administration, doing away with restrictions that President Biden added to drone strikes and raids outside of Iraq and Syria, which are the only two countries the U.S. officially considers combat zones. Biden's rules required permission from the White House to target militants outside Iraq and Syria unless they were high-ranking commanders. But the rule had a major loophole. Strikes could be ordered if they could be framed as self-defense. And so effectively, Biden's rules didn't do too much, because in Somalia, which is really, where one of the frequent places where there's drone strikes, the U.S. just claims, it's self-defense. It's self-defense of the Somali government. Somehow that's self-defense of the U.S. So it's not like they're calling Biden every time they're bombing Somalia. But Trump's rules give commanders the ability to target any militants belonging to organizations the U.S. considers terrorist organizations without White House approval. And this was first reported by CBS News, and it was confirmed by Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense. He shared the article on X and said that it was correct. And this news comes amid an uptick in U.S. airstrikes in Somalia and Syria. The drone wars, the war on terror, continues. And U.S. officials told CBS that Al-Shabaab in Somalia and the Houthis in Yemen were discussed as potential targets by the Trump administration. So far, we have not seen the U.S., at least publicly known U.S. airstrikes in Yemen since Trump came into office. But over the past couple weeks, the U.S. has started bombing Al-Shabaab in Somalia again under Trump. So that's what this next story is about here. The U.S. launches airstrikes against Al-Shabaab in Somalia. So the U.S. launched 3 airstrikes in Somalia against Al-Shabaab within the past 2 weeks, marking an escalation of the U.S. air war in the country. The series of airstrikes started with one on February 20th, which U.S. Africa Command, AFRICOM, said was launched in central Somalia. The strike marked the first known U.S. attack on Al-Shabaab under the new Trump administration. there were U.S. airstrikes against ISIS in Somalia, in Puntland, in the northeast, which is like a semi-autonomous region. But this is against Al-Shabaab. And so, I thought maybe for a minute that they were just going to target ISIS in Somalia and not go for Al-Shabaab, because everybody knows Al-Shabaab's, they're not a global threat. They're a local group that have aspirations for control in Somalia, and they control a significant amount of territory as well. And drone bombing them for years and years hasn't won any wars. So that was February 20th. And then there was another U.S. airstrike in Somalia on February 25th against Al-Shabaab. And then another one just on Saturday on March 1st, which AFRICOM claims killed several terrorists. The other ones, they didn't say anything about casualties. They claim that no civilians were harmed in these strikes, but the U.S. is notorious for hiding civilian casualties in Somalia particularly. I mean, think about how little media coverage it gets. It's kind of insane to me how little media coverage the drone war in Somalia gets. I mean, if you're listening or watching, let me know if you've even heard about these airstrikes anywhere else, because I've just found them on AFRICOM press releases. And so these ramped up airstrikes come amid this news that Trump has loosened the rules of engagement, lifting these restrictions. And during his first term in office, President Trump, this is kind of a repeat. Trump came in because Obama, he was the drone king, and he killed so many civilians and killed American citizens that they did put some restrictions on drone strikes, nothing that significant. But Trump came in and he loosened that stuff and ramped up the drone war in Somalia. And he bombed Somalia, more than any other U.S. president against Al-Shabaab. And again, what did this do? And then Biden came in and he redeployed troops to Somalia. He also continued to bomb Al-Shabaab, but not nearly at the rate as Trump. So I think we're just seeing 3 of these airstrikes within a couple weeks. I mean, that's a lot when it comes to this type of drone war. So it's just not a good sign. I mean, we might see Trump go back to that rate of bombing Somalia, which was a few times a month. I think the most was 60 times in a year or something like that. So not good. And then Al-Shabaab, they hype up the threat of Al-Shabaab because it is a relatively big organization compared to some of these other groups. But, and they are, they declared loyalty to Al-Qaeda in 2012, but that was after years of fighting the U.S. and its proxies. The U.S. backed an Ethiopian invasion of Somalia in 2006, and that ousted the Islamic Courts Union, which was a coalition of these Muslim groups that had power in Mogadishu briefly after they deposed some CIA-backed warlords. So the Islamic Courts Union took power, and then Ethiopia took them out. They were backed by the U.S., and then the Al-Shabaab was kind of the radical sect of the Islamic Courts Union, and then they started attacking the Ethiopian occupation troops. And then again, it wasn't until 2012. 2007 was their first claimed attack on Ethiopian troops occupying Mogadishu. Then 2012 was when they declared, that they were aligned with Al-Qaeda. And who even knows at this point how, if they have any kind of relationship with Al-Qaeda as things stand now. All right. So the next one here, the U.S. confirms a drone strike in Syria's Idlib province. So more drone strikes in Syria. This one is from Jason Ditz. So actually, this is the U.S. confirming a strike that happened last Sunday on February 23rd. If you remember last week, I covered there was a U.S. drone strike in Idlib, and then the next day there was one reported, but it wasn't confirmed by the U.S., so they have confirmed it. And they're claiming that they killed Muhammad Yusuf Zia Taleh, who has been labeled as a senior military leader of the Al-Qaeda affiliate Haras al-Din. And, these guys, there's just no information online about this guy, so who knows exactly who he is. According to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, they had a few different names for him, and they said he was Turkish. But again, we just don't really know, and this is just the nature of the drone wars. We're just left out of the dark, especially as they lift these restrictions and transparency things. And Haras al-Din said that they dissolved, last month in January. So that was 2 months ago now. But the U.S. has been drone bombing them since then, and they're aligned. Haras al-Din and HTS, which is the Al-Qaeda link group that took over Syria, they've clashed over the years, but they've also are fluid and kind of swap members and stuff, very similar ideology. So my guess is that they're just trying to integrate with the new Syrian government that's led by another Al-Qaeda linked organization. So, again, we just don't know what exactly the U.S. is doing here. Who exactly are they killing? How is this having any kind of effect? So, all right, the next one here. The IDF told to protect Syrian Druze in signs of deeper intervention. So this is another one from Jason. So the Israeli military has been instructed to prepare to defend the Druze minority in the Damascus suburb of Jaramana as Israel's military invasion of southern Syria expands and the pretext of protecting the Druze minority in Syria becomes part of the narrative. So now this is exactly what Jason said. This is a pretext for Israel to push further into southern Syria. They're saying now that they're protecting the Druze minority. Like Israel cares so much about the Druze. And this is, they're saying that because there's clashes between, and the Druze certainly have, it's not like they're taking advantage of a real situation here. Again, with this Al-Qaeda, this HTS government, there's been all these reprisals against the Alawites, and there's been attacks on other minorities like the Druze and Christians. But this is clearly just Israel taking advantage of the situation to try to gain more territory. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. unfreezes military aid for Taiwan. So the U.S. has quietly released $870 million in funding for military aid to Taiwan after it was briefly paused during the Trump administration's freeze on foreign aid. Reuters first reported on February 21st that the U.S. released the military aid for Taiwan as part of $5.3 billion in exemptions from the foreign aid pause. China, which strongly opposes U.S. support for Taiwan, reacted to the news on February 26th. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Lin Zhan said, quote, "We are deeply concerned over relevant reports. China has all along opposed U.S. military assistance to China's Taiwan region, which has severely violated the One China principle," end quote. Lin added that the U.S. should stop arming Taiwan, of course. So the big important detail here is that the U.S. has sold weapons to Taiwan for decades. Since 1979, that was the year that the U.S. cut diplomatic relations with Taiwan to open up with China as part of a normalization deal with China. Since then, the U.S. has always sold weapons, which China says is a violation of their agreements with the U.S., which they have a case for that, but everything was kind of vague, purposely vague. But in recent years, in 2023, the U.S. started providing U.S.-funded military aid to Taiwan, which marked an escalation. And that really, China's not happy about that. In 2024, President Biden signed off on more than $1 billion in military aid for Taiwan. So this might be some of that they have released now after initially pausing it. The Chinese Defense Ministry issued a pretty strong warning against U.S. support for Taiwan and the Democratic Progressive Party in Taiwan. That's the ruling party, the DPP. And they're kind of encouraging this U.S. support. China, is this is the most sensitive thing, as China says. It's the first red line in U.S.-China relations that must not be crossed. So it's very provocative toward China. Whether, no matter what your opinion on the situation in Taiwan is, that's just the reality. That's how China views this. And the U.S. knows that by providing this kind of support, it's going to raise tensions. And this is all done in the name of deterrence, deterring a war, this increased support for Taiwan in recent years. But as you can see from China's actions and rhetoric, it's just making war more likely. So this seems like a repeat of what happened in Ukraine. And this is a part of the thinking of the Trump administration. Guys like Marco Rubio, they're huge China hawks, and they want to increase support for Taiwan and build up the military bases in Southeast Asia, in the Asia Pacific. That's a big part of the wind down in Ukraine. All right, so the next one here, Turkish-PKK clashes erupt in northern Iraq. So this article is from the New Arab. So over the weekend, I mentioned that the leader of the PKK, who's been in jail for a few decades, said that the group should dissolve and put down its arms. And then the PKK came out, I think maybe it was Saturday, and they announced, a ceasefire with Turkey. And, the PKK is in northern Iraq, in Syria, in parts of Turkey. So it's a big deal, and they've been in conflict with Turkey for decades. So it could really change things in the region. But there's fighting happening now in Iraq that erupted on Sunday between Turkish military forces and the PKK in northern Iraq. According to local Kurdish media in Erbil, that's Iraq, the confrontation lasted approximately 45 minutes. Eyewitnesses reported that the clashes occurred around dawn. The fierce violence saw heavy gunfire causing alarm among residents, but no civilian casualties were reported. So we don't know if there were, the number of casualties between the PKK and Turkey, but so they announced a ceasefire and then there's some fighting, but it says it only lasted 45 minutes. So hopefully things calm down now and they can work towards some kind of deal. But we'll see. It's hard to believe that the PKK and Turkey is going to start getting along. All right, so the last story here. Senator Lee and Representative Massie call for the U.S. to exit NATO. So this one is from Kyle Anzalone, again at the Libertarian Institute. He's been very busy lately, Kyle. A pair of Republican lawmakers voiced their support for the U.S. exiting NATO. So this is Senator Mike Lee from Utah. He posted on X. He said, let's get out of NATO. And then Thomas Massie, the Kentucky congressman, said, let's do it. It's a relic of the Cold War. So it's good to see at least some members of Congress saying that. And Mike Lee is good on Ukraine. He's been good on Ukraine. He's bad on Israel, but he has been very good on the Ukraine war. And I think this got boosted from Elon Musk too, who I guess he is a advisor to the government. This is Musk. He wrote on X, quote, I always wondered why NATO continued to exist, even though its nemesis and reason to exist, the Warsaw Pact, had dissolved, end quote. So at least there's some talk about leaving NATO happening. All right, so that's it for the news. Lots of stuff again. Just craziness. Really hoping that things don't get worse in Gaza, that some miracle happens and there's some kind of deal. But go check out our viewpoints. One from Joy Metzler. I am seeking a discharge from the U.S. military. I was inspired by Aaron Bushnell. That's published at Mondo Weiss. One from Jeffrey Sachs. The geopolitics of peace. One from Mark Sills. Slocks and choke points. Panama, Greenland, Canada, and indigenous people. One from Matthew Petty. Reason, the Pentagon keeps losing equipment and buying stuff it doesn't need. And our spotlight is from Ashley Gate, and the Oscar goes to the Pentagon. So please go check all that out. Whew, that was a lot of stuff. You could always support us by sharing the show. Tell your friends about antiwar.com. Like, comment, and subscribe. Follow us on social media, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, where we just crossed 10,000 followers. I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.